Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lain. In this video, I'll be critiquing the ideas of Slavoj Zizek and quoting excerpts from Eliot Rosenstock's Zizek in the Clinic and my own book, Bash Bash Revolution, as I try to figure out how the James Bond villains Karl Stromberg and Hugo Drax could have won.
How much do you want?
How much? I'm not interested in extortion. I intend to change the face of history.
By destroying the world?
By creating a world. A new and beautiful world beneath the sea.
Before I begin, let me give you the context behind this video. An old friend of mine recently broke his leg and ended up sleeping on our couch. He needed a place to stay until he was mobile enough to be able to climb the stairs to his attic apartment. He's sort of taken up permanent residence in front of our TV, and a few weeks back, I thought we might pick out a movie to watch on Netflix. As a joke, and a bit statistically, I suggested we watch Roger Moore in For Your Eyes Only. My friend called my bluff and doubled down. Since then, I've watched every Roger Moore James Bond film. I've seen the one with the guy from the 7-Up commercials, the one with Tattoo, the one where James Bond dresses like a clown, the one where Christopher Walken does his best impression of a piece of plywood, and 2 versions of the same film where the bad guys try to destroy and then recreate humanity. In The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond teams up with the lovely Soviet agent XXX, and they both work to stop a megalomaniacal villain named Karl Stromberg. In Moonraker, Bond hooks up with the CIA agent Dr. Holly Goodhead, and they both work to stop a megalomaniacal villain named Hugo Drax. Stromberg is your typical accelerationist. He wants to put an end to the corrupt, decadent, materialist world as we know it, and replace it with a new and beautiful underwater city that he calls Atlantis. Stromberg is convinced that it is only by speeding up the destruction that is already happening in society that we can arrive at his underwater utopia. Hugo Drax, on the other hand, is more of an eco-fascist than an accelerationist. His plan is to drop enough canisters of deadly nerve gas on the Earth to wipe out all of humanity, but leave all the other life intact, and then create a new, multicultural but genetically perfect humanity on his space station. For Drax, the problem isn't a destructive and decadent civilization or system, but the genetic inferiority of most of humanity. Bond stops them both, of course, but he also saves them from the humiliation of watching their dreams self-destruct. After all, to imagine a self-sustaining society on a space station requires dreaming up technology that is basically equivalent to magic. While living in an underwater city might be theoretically possible, after all, a futurist named Philip Pauly shares Stromberg's vision and is hard at work creating plans for a future underwater moral order. Still, there is no reason to believe that living under the sea would solve the social problems we're facing on land. These villains and their plans for world conquest and self-transcendence were incredibly naive. When I imagine what would have happened next if Bond hadn't won the day, I think of Jonestown, the Manson family, and Heaven's Gate. The utopian visionaries in these James Bond films aren't merely fictional characters created in order to serve as a foil for Bond, but they also reflect a strain of utopianism that arose in the late 60s and 70s during and after the failure of the New Left. And like it or not, along with understanding how and why the Soviet Union was a disaster, these moments of insanity, these Bond villains, are also a part of the left's legacy that we need to explain and come to grips with. To put it another way, how is it that so much of the radical left ended up sounding like a Bond villain?
For justice thunders condemnation, a better world is in birth. No more traditions change shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been naught, we shall be all.
Good.
Perfect commodity. Why?
It was already Marx who long ago emphasized that a commodity is never just a simple object that we buy and consume. A commodity is an object full of theological, even metaphysical niceties. Its presence always reflects an invisible transcendence.
According to the radical philosopher and Lacanian psychoanalyst Slavoj Zizek, the main problem for the left is not simply to strip away or escape from the system we currently have. For instance, it's not just to get rid of money. The task before us is not to find our way back to something, to rediscover our authentic selves, or to get rid of the bad and decadent people so that the correct group has power. But rather, it's to find a better mediating force for a new society. To illustrate this idea that the left needs a new mediating structure, Zizek often tells the following joke. A man who believes himself to be a kernel of corn is taken to a mental hospital where the doctors do their best to convince him that he's not a grain of corn. However, when he is cured, when he is convinced that he is not a grain of corn, and he's allowed to leave the hospital, he immediately comes back, trembling and very frightened. There's a chicken out in the courtyard, and he is afraid that it will eat him. "My dear fellow," says the doctor, "you know very well that you are not a grain of corn, but a man." "Of course I know," replies the patient, "but does the chicken know?" Zizek would make this point again and again. He would say that what we needed was a better chicken. The difficulty with Zizek's approach is that he misses how our current chicken has taken on a material rather than a merely ideological form. What he misses is that that man in the courtyard, the mental patient, might very well get eaten by that chicken. His rejection and mistaken reading of Marx's labor theory of value is a consequence of his failure to understand how that chicken will eat us. To illustrate my point, let's compare what Zizek says about Pokemon Go to how I use Pokemon in my novel Bash Revolution.
I would like to begin, I'm sorry if some of you know this example of mine already, with Pokemon Go, the game. As you know, I'm sorry if I treat you like idiots now, Pokemon Go is a location-based augmented reality game, typically played on mobile phones. So players use the device's GPS and camera to capture, battle, and train virtual creatures, Pokemon, who appear on the screen as if they were in the same real-world location as the player. We look at reality and we interact with reality through the fantasy frame of the digital screen. And this frame supplements reality with virtual elements which sustain our desire to participate in the game. And I think the same holds for all other ideological pseudo-entities which have to be added to reality in order to make it complete and meaningful.
For Zizek, the trick to our mediating ideological structures, the way they work, is that these ideas give a form to our otherwise directionless desire. An ideological figure like a Pokemon is a fantasy figure that supplements an otherwise meaningless or flat reality. Zizek is correct in his observation, but only up to a point. What he fails to see is that the main supplement in capitalism, the oppositional supplement to our celebrated market freedoms, is not merely an idea in our heads, not even just a structure for our desires, but is the very structure that guides our productive and material practices. The real ideological supplement in a capitalist society is not identical with Lacan's objet A, is not an object cause of our desire, but rather is an objective fact in the world that we relate to, whether we desire to or not. Zizek uses Pokemon Go as an example of a strictly ideological structure by leaving the game in its current context. That is, he leaves it as it is, a distraction from productive work, something we take up during our leisure time. In Bash Revolution, on the other hand, I imagine what would happen if Pokemon Go was no longer a mere leisure time activity, but became central to our society in the same way that the commodity is central today. One of the characters, a world champion Super Smash Bros. Player named Kufo, observes, "A commodity isn't just a useful item that people want and can use. It's a social control mechanism, because these commodities determine what we do. It's complicated, but if we didn't have to work to make the stuff we needed, if we could play a video game for our food instead, there wouldn't be any commodities left." Zizek imagines that society is ideological in so much as we're living in an augmented reality that can be used by manipulative populists to create political projects that reinforce society as it is, that protect against the sort of organizing that might lead to redistributist policies, banking reforms, universal health care, labor organizing, and a slew of other undefined changes that seem impossible under capitalism. Whereas I would argue that there's a key distinction between ideology and what Marx called a fetish. The capitalist world is similar to an augmented reality, but is one in which the fantasies that support our social relationships have vast and deep material consequences. To some extent, these reforms really are impossible under capitalism. In his book, Zizek in the Clinic, Eliot Rosenstock observes that the Lacanian definition of liberation is not one wherein one can break free from ideology or fantasy. We need chickens. We need Pokemons. Rosenstock asks, but if one is doomed to never find what is real, or what we really want, then where does any sense of liberation come in? The answer is that liberation means discovering the ability to change the very circle we are living in. But this new chicken will have to be more than a mere ideological figure. In order to break free of the constraints of capitalism, we'll have to do more than find a new totalitarian figure to guide us. We'll have to do more than imagine a utopian city under the sea. We'll instead have to find a new basis for our production, a new game to play that will produce and reproduce the useful things we need in order to survive and thrive as a species. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.